is where they slit my throat. And had some sort of plastic tube. The IV site went bad here, and they cut it out and left me with a scar. And I also have the scar from my feeding tube. My body is scarred now.
34-year-old Haslyn Bostwick is a native of South America who lives in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Haslyn knows a lot about one particular parasite, Plasmodium falciparum. It is the most deadly of all parasites, and more commonly known as malaria.
I go into the interior of Guyana very often. I used to spend up to 10 days in there at a time. And in order to make sure that I don't come into, nothing bites me, I would make sure that my tent was sprayed before I go to bed at night. While I'm outdoor, I make sure that my body is totally covered so nothing could bite me.
In the spring of 1999, Haslyn had her blood checked for malaria when she returned from a trip to oversee a gold mine she owns in Guyana. She wasn't feeling well, but her tests proved negative. So Haslyn took her son on a school trip to Washington, D.C. She became weaker, more nauseous. 3 days into the trip, Haslyn took to her bed.
So I lie down and then I got up later on, went to the bathroom and went back to bed. And when I went back to bed, I never got back up again.
Haslyn Bostwick slipped into a coma. She was taken over by the malaria parasites. Haslyn joined the ranks of 250 million victims around the globe who contract malaria each year. 3 million of those people die, and it's the young who suffer the most. Every 30 seconds of every hour of every day, the malaria parasite kills a child.
The research done over even the last 50 years have not been able to reduce the mortality, the in-hospital fatality rate of severe malaria in children in the tropics, in primary care hospitals in the tropics, 1%. Nothing that we've done has been able to reduce the mortality of severe malaria.
Malaria had been a mystery for centuries. No one knew exactly where it came from, nor how it was passed from victim to victim. The evil illness seemed simply to emerge from the stale air around swamps. In fact, the literal translation of malaria is bad air. In 1880, a protozoan parasite was found living in the blood of malaria patients. The female Anopheles mosquito was soon identified as the vector for the malaria parasite. "60 years later, malaria was still the leading cause of sickness and death in humans on Earth. The medicine quinine, made from the bark of the cinchona tree, had been used to ease symptoms for 400 years. But it took until the 1950s to find hope in a weapon that would wipe out malaria's carrier. Chlorinated hydrocarbon insecticide, DDT. There was nothing quite like it before, and there has been nothing like it since. Here was a chemical that could be sprayed on the walls of a house, and for up to 6 months, any insect that rested on that surface would die. It was then thought to be non-toxic to humans, and it was inexpensive to manufacture. The female Anopheles mosquito was public enemy #1, and World Health officials had a brand new weapon. Eradication efforts were effective in North America and Europe, but after a decade of trying to annihilate the mosquito in Africa, India, and Asia, the success of DDT slowed. War, corruption, inaction, famine, and a host of other problems detracted from the battle against malaria. By the late 1970s, the World Health Organization bitterly admitted that malaria was back and worse than ever. Today, only the HIV virus comes close to the destruction malaria brings upon this earth.
It's estimated by some economists that malaria alone reduces the gross domestic product of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa by about 1%, perhaps even more. That translates into billions of dollars of loss in those countries every year. So it has an enormous impact. In every military campaign in which U.S. forces have been involved in the last 100 years, where malaria was transmitted, we've always had more casualties to malaria than we've had from hostile fire. That means, from a military perspective, that malaria has tremendous mission-aborting potential.
The swamps around Haslen Bostwick's South American gold mine were a perfect breeding ground for the Anopheles mosquito. As the mosquito fed on Haslen's blood in its nightly ritual, it released thousands of thread-like malaria parasites that were stored in its salivary glands. For 12 days, Haslen would go without symptoms while parasites invaded her liver and transformed into organisms that moved on to her red blood cells. The tiny creatures divided and multiplied by the millions. They became so numerous that her red blood cells exploded. By the time Haslen fell into a coma, parasites were shutting down most of her vital organs, including her brain.
The only organ that was functioning was my heart. Everything else had already shut down by the time I got to the hospital. And they had to pretty much, they had to put catheters and whatever else they had to put in me.
Dr. Stephen Hoffman was rushed in to work with Haslen.
So what was going on was these parasites were binding to the small blood vessels in her brain and blocking up blood flow. If there's no blood flow, then no oxygen gets to your brain, and you slip into a coma.
After centuries of suffering and death, decades after the discovery that malaria is a parasite, and research into a cure, there is still no effective modern drug to combat malaria in its late stages. And there is no practical vaccine against malaria.
We're in a situation where the two major drugs in this world used for treating severe malaria, cerebral malaria, severe malarial anemia, hyperparasitemia, high levels of parasites in the bloodstream, are quinine and artemisinin derivatives. Both of those have been available for hundreds, if not thousands of years. It's not that we haven't developed new drugs for treating the parasite, but that the parasite has either developed resistance to those drugs or they're actually not as good as these age-old remedies.
Through the developed world's best medical efforts, Haslen did stabilize, and miraculously, she survived. After 5 weeks of devastating illness, Haslen responded to treatment and has been malaria-free ever since.
This particular parasite kills